Naomi Brooks had always known that silence could be sacred. In her home, silence was a language of love, of peace. It was the soft hush after her daughter's bedtime, the gentle hum of the white noise machine in the hallway, the comforting stillness of the living room bathed in the warm light of a single lamp. Silence was how her daughter, Zara, communicated with the world. But that night, silence came with a knock. 3 knocks, sharp and measured. Not desperate, not loud, just calculated. Naomi had just settled onto the couch with a cup of chamomile tea, ready to savor her first real moment of rest that day. She placed the cup down slowly, the unease already blooming in her chest as she moved toward the door. Outside stood a police officer, young and straight-backed, with one hand resting near his holster. His expression was neutral, almost rehearsed. But behind him, arms crossed and eyes glittering with triumph, was Meredith Langston, the president of the Brighton Oaks Homeowners Association. And between them, barefoot and wide-eyed, was Zara. Naomi's breath caught. Zara, her 8-year-old daughter, stood like a statue on the porch. Her curls were tousled from the wind, her little fists pressed hard against her thighs, her eyes unblinking and filled with confusion. "Zara, baby?" Naomi's voice came out softer than she intended, almost trembling. "What's going on?" The officer took a half-step forward. "Ma'am, we received a report of suspected child neglect. The caller stated that the child refuses to speak. We need to ask a few questions." For a moment, Naomi couldn't comprehend what she was hearing. Then the word hit her again. Asterisk refuses asterisk, and the absurdity of it twisted into her gut like a knife. She let out a bitter laugh. "She's autistic. She's nonverbal. That's not neglect. That's her diagnosis." Meredith Langston stepped forward, sidestepping the officer like this was her show. "We don't have that kind of information on file," she said with clipped finality. "When a child refuses to communicate, it becomes a safety concern for the rest of the community. We don't know what's going on in her head." Naomi's mouth opened, then closed. She could have said 1,000 things, quoted statutes, cited medical documents, unrolled a list of diagnoses from therapists and specialists. But her mind froze. Not because she didn't know how to fight this, but because this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was targeted. This was war. She knelt down and opened her arms. "Come here, baby." Zara didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her small frame rushed forward, collapsing into Naomi's arms like a puzzle piece sliding back into place. Naomi rose to her feet, her daughter tucked protectively against her side. Her voice was a blade. "I want her badge number," she said, eyes locked on the officer. "In the name of whoever authorized this call." The officer hesitated, glancing sideways at Langston. Naomi's voice didn't waver. "You're not taking my daughter." But they did. They called it standard protocol, a temporary separation for a wellness check. But there were no charges, no signs of abuse, just silence used as a weapon, and a little girl torn from her mother's arms. As the squad car's taillights disappeared down the road, Naomi stood on the porch, her arms aching with absence. Her baby was gone. The hours that followed blurred into panic. Naomi called dispatch, then Child Protective Services, then the emergency room. She drove like a machine, thoughts racing faster than the speed limit. At the ER, she found Zara alone in a cold, white room, eyes red, cheeks damp, her silence now filled with pain. Naomi didn't speak. She simply held her daughter and rocked gently back and forth, whispering, "I've got you. I've got you." She filled out paperwork, explained diagnoses, presented medical history. Staff who had looked at her with suspicion slowly shifted to guilt. Apologies came, strained and late. When they finally returned home that night, it was past 9. Naomi carried Zara inside, wrapped her in a weighted blanket, kissed her forehead, and sat beside her. Then she checked the mailbox. A thick envelope on HOA letterhead. No return address. Inside, a notice of noncompliance. A mandatory behavioral assessment hearing. Zara was required to appear before the HOA board to address ongoing behavioral concerns. Naomi sat on the kitchen floor, lights still off, letter in her lap, her hands trembling. This wasn't ignorance. This wasn't fear. This was cruelty. Coordinated. Precise. And now it was personal. Zara regressed in the days that followed. She stopped going outside. Stopped playing. Stopped eating. She sat on the couch and rocked back and forth in a rhythm Naomi hadn't seen since the early years, back when everything felt like a battlefield. When Zara began softly banging her forehead into a pillow, Naomi knew. This wasn't a setback. This was trauma. Naomi made the calls, therapists, speech pathologists, neurologists. She kept logs, timelines, notes. She documented every letter from the HOA, every phrase that dripped with prejudice, unfit, disturbance, unresponsive child. And then, by sheer fate or faith, came the break. Howard, a neighbor down the street, a veteran with a Ring camera, offered her something she hadn't dared hope for. A recording. Footage of Meredith Langston speaking to another board member in front of Naomi's house. She just stands there like a freak, Langston said. Doesn't even speak. That ain't normal. What if she snaps? Naomi didn't smile out of joy. She smiled because she had proof. Not suspicion. Not implication. Evidence. She filed a federal lawsuit. ADA violations. Emotional distress. Gross negligence. Names were named. Meredith Langston, personally. Officer Dean Carver, for wrongful detainment. The Brighton Oaks HOA, for discriminatory practices. And the press came running. The courtroom was full the day of the trial. Naomi stood alone at the plaintiff's table, calm and unshaken. She presented everything: medical evaluations, trauma reports, therapist testimony. The jury listened. The judge leaned in. Photos of Zara, silenced, withdrawn, harmed, filled the room with a grief heavier than any argument. Then Naomi played the video. Langston's voice crackled through the courtroom. She just stands there like a freak. Silence followed. Thick. Absolute. Damning. It took the jury less than 4 hours. Verdict. In favor of Naomi Brooks. Damages, $250,000. Meredith Langston, removed from all HOA roles. Brighton Oaks, ordered to issue a public apology and complete ADA compliance training. Naomi left the courthouse and said only one thing to reporters. I'm going home to my daughter. That night, she knelt beside Zara, who was curled under her favorite blanket. No words passed, just a touch, a presence, a knowing. Naomi held her and cried, not out of rage or relief, but because, finally, justice had spoken for the child who couldn't. Months later, Zara sat beneath her favorite oak tree, sketching spirals in the dirt with a crayon. She wasn't speaking. Naomi didn't expect her to, but she was smiling. And that was enough. Naomi's life changed, too. She joined the Office of Disability Justice. She rewrote housing laws. She gave speeches to parents, lawyers, lawmakers. She titled her talk, When the Law Fights Back. And then one quiet Thursday, as Naomi stepped away to make tea, she returned to find Zara at her laptop. Typing. 6 words appeared on the screen. You stopped the bad lady. Naomi fell to her knees and held her daughter. No, baby, she whispered. You did. Because in the end, it wasn't Naomi's voice that won. It was Zara's silence, heard at last.